Welcome to Stories of Slavery. In this episode, we're traveling back to Mississippi, 1857, to a wedding staged as a demonstration of authority. A plantation owner orchestrating his own marriage to twins he held in bondage. But within 10 hours, something occurred that defied explanation. An unexplainable turn that spread fear, hushed whispers, and a conspiracy of silence across the entire estate. This is a raw and heavy narrative. So, pause for a moment, center yourself, and listen closely. Before we proceed, make sure to subscribe and drop a comment letting me know which city and country you're tuning in from. Your engagement ensures these stories are honored rather than erased. Let's begin. On the evening of June 14, 1857, in Natchez, Mississippi, one of the wealthiest plantation owners across the entire South organized his own marriage ceremony. He was 52. His brides were 19. They were twins, and he considered them his property. What unfolded 10 hours following that service would become one of Adams County's most whispered about events, yet you'll never locate it in any official documentation. It won't appear in any textbook. Because what those two young women accomplished that night was so astonishing, so carefully orchestrated, and so flawlessly carried out that those who witnessed it concluded the world must never learn the truth. This is the account they attempted to conceal. This is the account of Ruth and Miriam, the twins who bided their time for 12 years to claim a single night. To grasp what occurred inside that manor, you first must grasp where it occurred. Natchez, Mississippi in the 1850s was not merely another southern town. It stood as the center of American prosperity constructed on human agony. In the years before the Civil War, more millionaires resided in Natchez than in New York City. The explanation was straightforward: cotton, and the people compelled to harvest it. The mansions lining the bluffs above the Mississippi River stood as tributes to an economy dependent on human trafficking, coerced labor, and calculated brutality. Historians approximate that by 1860, the enslaved inhabitants of Adams County outnumbered white citizens by over 3-1. This wasn't the refined South of moonlit evenings and magnolia trees that later eras would romanticize. This was a place where humans were traded on bank steps, where families were split apart as casually as someone might sell a horse, where youngsters learned from infancy that their physical selves were owned by another. Among the grand estates dotting the landscape, Blackwood Plantation distinguished itself through its expanse and its quiet. The property encompassed over 3,000 acres of prime cotton land, stretching from the river lowlands to the pine woods bordering the Homachito wilderness. The primary residence was a Greek Revival building with 12 white columns and a reputation that made even veteran slave dealers uncomfortable. Its proprietor was Colonel Silas Blackwood. He had received the plantation from his father in 1839 and had dedicated almost 2 decades expanding it into one of the area's most lucrative enterprises. By 1857, Blackwood Plantation contained over 200 enslaved individuals and generated more than 800 cotton bales annually. Officially, Silas Blackwood was valued at nearly $2 million. In modern currency, that would classify him as a billionaire. Yet his riches conveyed only part of his narrative. Silas Blackwood wasn't merely cruel. Cruelty suggests emotion, some twisted investment in others' pain. Silas was something more severe. He was systematic. He operated his plantation as a machine runs a factory. Discipline was measured for optimum effect. Fear was allocated deliberately to block any chance of rebellion. He had examined the techniques of other planters and improved them into a method that drew the highest possible work from humans while maintaining them just healthy enough to function. He divided families not from malice, but because he thought isolated people were simpler to manage than those with deep connections. He reduced food portions not from greed, but because he had determined the precise minimum calories needed to sustain output. In the terminology of his period, he was a contemporary, scientific planter. In our language, he was a monster who had discovered how to institutionalize evil. In the spring of 1845, Silas Blackwood journeyed to New Orleans for the yearly slave auction at the St. Louis Hotel. This stood as the South's biggest and most renowned slave market, where affluent planters collected to purchase humans as if choosing fine artwork. The auction hall featured a rotunda with a domed ceiling and marble flooring. Champagne was offered. Enslaved individuals were exhibited on an elevated stage, forced to walk, rotate, and display their teeth while white men assessed their value. On that specific March morning, Silas spotted something unusual. There stood a pair of young girls grasping hands. They were unmistakably twins, maybe 7 years old, with matching features and eyes holding an expression no child should ever wear, the expression of someone who has already witnessed the end of everything. The auctioneer highlighted the twins. Paired sets were uncommon and brought premium prices. He announced they had been taken from the Gold Coast of Africa, from a region now part of Ghana. He mentioned they were healthy, compliant, and youthful enough to be instructed for any role. Bidding started at $500 for the pair. It rapidly climbed. Silas Blackwood succeeded with a bid of $1,500, triple the typical cost for one enslaved child. When questioned why he had offered so much, Silas supposedly smiled and commented that twins brought good fortune in his family. His grandmother had been a twin. He viewed it as a sign. What he didn't realize, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that he had just acquired his own demise. The girls' names weren't Ruth and Miriam originally. Those were the labels later assigned by the plantation's domestic slaves, who insisted every person should carry a biblical name. Their true names, the ones whispered by their mother as she clutched them aboard the ship, were Adwoa and Akua, named for the days of their birth following a Akan tradition. Their grandmother had been an Okamfo, a conventional healer and spiritual guide among the Ashanti people. Before their capture, before raiders burned their village and marched survivors to the shore, their grandmother had invested years teaching them everything she knew, which plants cured fever, which roots eased pain, which leaves could induce sleep, and which flowers, prepared properly, could halt a human heart. This wisdom had been transmitted from mother to daughter for countless generations. It was knowledge that slavers and plantation owners never imagined existed. Why would they? They believed the individuals they bought were ignorant, primitive, scarcely human. They never considered that among their captives were doctors and engineers, priests and poets, scientists who comprehended the natural world in ways European medicine wouldn't discover for another century. The voyage from New Orleans to Natchez required 3 days by steamboat up the Mississippi River. Ruth and Miriam, as they would later be called, stood at the rail whenever allowed on deck, memorizing each river bend, every marker, every possible escape path. They didn't talk to one another in front of the white crew members. They had already realized their capacity to communicate in Twi, their mother tongue, was their greatest hidden advantage. To the crew, they appeared as frightened youngsters clinging together for solace. Actually, they were conducting reconnaissance. They were evaluating their circumstances. They were already formulating plans. Blackwood Plantation proved even harsher than the New Orleans slave market had prepared them for. At least in the city, there were crowds and noise and the occasional sight of free black people walking streets. Here, there was only the endless cotton fields stretching to the horizon, the quiet lines of slave cabins, and the large white house on the hill that seemed to observe everything like an all-seeing eye. Ruth and Miriam were allocated to the household staff, meaning they would function as domestic servants rather than field laborers. This was regarded as a benefit. The work was less physically demanding, the food improved, and the lodgings less crowded, but there was a price. House slaves lived under the continuous observation of the master and mistress. There was no moment of seclusion, no space for humanity, no break from the act of submission demanded every waking hour. The girls adapted quickly. They learned to keep their gaze down and voices soft. They learned which floorboards creaked and which stayed silent. They learned the household's patterns, when the family rose and when they slept, who drank excessively and who observed everything. They learned to interpret their captors' moods as a sailor reads weather, predicting storms before they arrived. And crucially, they learned to conceal themselves. Not physically, though they knew every hidden spot in that mansion. They learned to hide their intelligence, their fury, their recollections, their very identities behind masks of compliance so absolute that those around them forgot they were people at all. Silas Blackwood would later note in his journal that the twins were his most satisfactory acquisition, needing almost no discipline and performing duties with mechanical accuracy. He confused their survival tactic for acceptance. He mistook their patience for submission. That error would cost him everything. Years passed. Ruth was placed in the kitchen, where she learned to prepare elaborate meals for the Blackwood family and their numerous guests. Miriam worked as a chambermaid, tidying rooms and changing linens, becoming invisible as servants were expected to be. Every night after the house darkened and duties ended, they would gather in the small cabin they shared with 3 other enslaved women and whisper in Twi, exchanging everything they had observed, adding to the mental map they were constructing of the plantation and its surroundings. They discovered the Mississippi River was the primary route north and that some boats transported runaways hidden among cargo. They learned about the Homachito National Forest to the east, where swamps were so thick that dogs lost sense and search parties became disoriented. They learned that Cairo, Illinois, where the Ohio River met the Mississippi, was viewed as the gateway to freedom because Illinois was a free state. They stored every detail like weapons in an arsenal, awaiting the day they would need them. Ruth became proficient in the plantation's garden, learning to identify every plant in the carefully tended beds behind the kitchen. Mrs. Blackwood, Silas's wife, considered herself an amateur herbalist and maintained an extensive collection of medicinal plants for treating minor ailments among the household staff. What she didn't realize was that Ruth was quietly expanding her knowledge beyond medicine. The same garden holding chamomile and mint and lavender also bordered the woods where water hemlock grew wild along creek banks. Water hemlock, known to scientists as Cicuta maculata, ranks as the most poisonous plant native to North America. A single root can kill a full-grown man within hours. The toxin attacks the nervous system, causing violent convulsions before stopping the heart and lungs. Ruth learned to identify it by its distinctive purple-streaked stem and clusters of small white flowers. She learned its peak potency in early summer and how to extract its poison by crushing roots and filtering the liquid. She told no one except Miriam, and she never harvested it. Not yet. The time wasn't right. In 1853, everything shifted. Mrs. Blackwood died from yellow fever during an epidemic sweeping the Mississippi Valley. Silas mourned her publicly for exactly 6 weeks, the socially acceptable minimum, then started a new phase of his life that would eventually lead to his destruction. Without his wife's presence to provide even a thin appearance of respectability, Silas's desires became more evident. He began visiting the slave quarters at night. He started insisting certain enslaved women be assigned to the house permanently. He began hosting parties for his friends that household servants whispered about in tones of horror. Ruth and Miriam observed all this with focused attention, storing it with everything else they knew. They understood that eventually his focus would shift to them. They had known since the day he purchased them, since they saw how he looked at them when he thought no one was watching. They had been preparing for that day for 8 years. They just didn't know when it would come. It arrived in spring 1857. Ruth and Miriam were now 19. They had endured 12 years in captivity. They had mastered every skill expected of house slaves and many that no one anticipated. They could read and write, taught secretly by an elderly enslaved man named Solomon, who had been educated before his capture. They could calculate numbers mentally faster than the plantation's white overseer could with paper and pen. They knew the names and habits of every white family within 20 miles, information gathered from conversations overheard during dinner parties, and they knew every inch of land between Blackwood Plantation and the river from years of accompanying Mrs. Blackwood on her botanical outings. They were, in every meaningful way, prepared. They just needed the right moment. That moment came on a June morning when Silas Blackwood summoned them to his study. He sat behind his mahogany desk, dressed in his finest clothes, holding a glass of bourbon even though it was barely 10 a.m. He looked at them with an expression they had never seen before, a kind of greedy satisfaction, like a man about to sit down to a feast. He informed them he had decided to take a new wife, 2 wives actually. He had concluded Southern tradition was too restrictive, too bound by outdated customs. He was a powerful man. He could do as he pleased, and it pleased him to marry the twins. He would hold a ceremony on Saturday. It wouldn't be legal, naturally, since enslaved people couldn't legally marry anyone, least of all their masters, but it would be public. He would invite all the most prominent families in the county. He would dress them in white gowns. He would place rings on their fingers, and then they would belong to him in every way a human could belong to another. He smiled when he said this. He expected gratitude. Ruth and Miriam stood perfectly still, their faces revealing nothing. They had learned long ago to never let their captors see what they were thinking. Ruth spoke first. She said they were honored by his attention and would strive to be worthy of his kindness. Miriam added they would need time to prepare themselves and requested permission to have new dresses made for the occasion. Silas laughed with pleasure at their apparent acceptance. He told them they could have whatever they needed. He wanted this to be a celebration worthy of his status. He dismissed them with a wave. As they left his study, walking with slow, measured steps through the hallway and down the back stairs to the kitchen, neither spoke. They didn't need to. After 12 years, they could communicate without words, and both were thinking the same thing. Saturday, 4 days. It was finally time. That night, they held a council in their cabin. They spoke in Twi, using words that hadn't been heard by white ears in all their years of captivity. They laid out everything they knew and everything they needed to do. The ceremony would be held in the evening, meaning darkness would fall during the celebration. The most prominent families in the county would attend, meaning all attention would be on the main house. The household staff would be exhausted from preparations, meaning fewer people watching the slave quarters. Summer heat would mean windows left open and guards drowsy at their posts. Every factor favored them. It seemed as if fate itself had aligned to offer them this single chance. But they couldn't accomplish it alone. For their plan to work, they needed help from someone who knew the land even better than they did, someone with transportation access, someone with nothing left to lose. His name was Ezekiel. He was 43 and had been head coachman at Blackwood Plantation for 15 years. He was trusted to drive Silas to town, transport goods to market, carry messages to other plantations. This trust had given him freedom of movement few enslaved people ever experienced. It had also given him knowledge of every road, every back path, every hidden route between Natchez and the river. What Silas didn't know was that Ezekiel had spent years using this knowledge to help others escape. He had guided at least a dozen runaways to safe houses along the Underground Railroad, risking his life each time because he believed every person reaching freedom was a victory against the system that had stolen his own family. His wife had been sold to a Louisiana plantation 8 years ago. His 3 children had been sold separately to 3 different owners across the South. He didn't know if any still lived. He had nothing left except his skills and his burning hatred for everything Silas Blackwood represented. Ruth approached him on the second night while he cared for horses in the stable. She spoke quickly and directly, wasting no time on pleasantries. She told him what Silas planned for Saturday. She told him what she and Miriam planned in response. She told him they needed a driver who could get them to the river in darkness without capture. She asked if he was willing to risk death for a chance at vengeance and freedom. Ezekiel didn't hesitate. He had been waiting for someone brave enough to fight back for years. He asked only one question: would Silas suffer? Ruth looked him directly in the eyes, something enslaved people were forbidden to do with anyone. And she told him that Silas Blackwood would know exactly what was happening to him. He would feel everything, and the last thing he would see would be the faces of the women he thought he owned. Ezekiel nodded slowly. He told her he would have the fastest carriage ready and waiting behind the old tobacco barn at midnight on Saturday. He told her he knew a route through the Homachito swamps no search party could follow. He told her that whatever happened, he wouldn't let them be taken back. That was his promise. His only condition was that he would come with them. There was nothing left for him at Blackwood Plantation except memories of loss. He wanted to see the North before he died. Ruth agreed. They shook hands in the stable darkness. 2 people making a pact that would lead either to freedom or death. There was no middle ground. The next 3 days were the longest of their lives. Ruth and Miriam went through their regular duties while secretly preparing. Ruth harvested the water hemlock from the creek bank, cutting roots in the gray light before dawn when no one watched. She processed it carefully using techniques her grandmother had taught her years ago in a world that now seemed like a dream. The liquid she produced was clear and nearly odorless, with only a faint bitter taste that could be masked by strong wine. She stored it in a small glass vial that had once held Mrs. Blackwood's perfume, hidden in the false bottom of her sewing basket. Miriam worked on the dresses Silas had ordered, white cotton gowns he wanted them to wear for the ceremony. She followed his instructions exactly, except for one small modification. She added hidden pockets to the inside seams, invisible to casual inspection, large enough to hold the vial and a few other essential items. Everything had to look normal. Everything had to seem like acceptance until the moment it wasn't. On Friday night, the household was consumed with preparations for the next day's ceremony. Extra servants had been borrowed from neighboring plantations. The kitchen was producing enough food for 100 guests. The grand ballroom was being decorated with flowers and candles. Silas walked through the house, inspecting every detail, more animated than anyone had seen him in years. He was in the prime of his life, he announced to anyone who would listen. He was about to begin a new chapter. He was going to show all of Natchez that Silas Blackwood answered to no one and followed no rules except his own. He looked at Ruth and Miriam as he said this, and they saw in his eyes exactly what he was, not just cruel but proud of his cruelty, not just powerful but intoxicated by his power. He believed himself untouchable. He believed his money and status placed him above consequences. He had forgotten, if he ever knew, that the people he considered his property were human beings with memories and minds and the capacity for planning that matched or exceeded his own. That night, as he slept peacefully in his massive bed, Ruth and Miriam lay awake in their cabin, reviewing every detail of the next day one final time. They knew they would be either free or dead by Sunday morning. They had made peace with both possibilities. Saturday, June 14, 1857, dawned hot and humid, the kind of Mississippi summer day when the air itself seemed to perspire. The household rose early to complete final preparations. Carriages began arriving by late afternoon, carrying the wealthy planter families of Adams County in their finest clothes. The men wore tailcoats, and the women wore hoop dresses requiring 2 servants to help them through doorways. They gathered in the ballroom and on the front veranda, drinking champagne and whiskey, gossiping about politics and cotton prices and the increasingly worrying news from up north about abolitionists and Republicans. None of them thought there was anything unusual about what they were about to witness. The relationship between masters and enslaved women was an open secret throughout the South. The only novel thing about Silas's ceremony was his decision to make it public. Some found it distasteful, others found it bold. All were curious enough to attend. At 7 p.m., as the sun began setting over the Mississippi River in a blaze of orange and red, Ruth and Miriam made their entrance. They walked down the grand staircase arm in arm, dressed in their white gowns, their hair arranged with white flowers. Every eye in the room turned to watch them. They moved with perfect grace, their faces serene, showing no trace of the rage burning beneath the surface. Silas stood at the bottom of the stairs, beaming with proprietary pride. He took their hands as they reached him and led them to the center of the ballroom where a justice of the peace waited with a Bible. The ceremony was brief and meaningless. Enslaved people couldn't legally marry and certainly couldn't marry their masters. But Silas wanted the performance. He wanted witnesses to his power. He wanted everyone in the county to know these 2 women were his to do with as he pleased. The justice read some words. Silas placed cheap rings on their fingers, and then it was done. The guests applauded politely. The celebration began. What happened next in the hours between the ceremony and midnight would later become the subject of endless speculation. Some witnesses said the twins seemed almost happy, smiling and gracious as they moved through the party. Others noted they were never far from Silas, attending to him with what appeared genuine devotion. Ruth personally served him every glass of wine he drank. Miriam made sure his plate was always full. They laughed at his jokes. They endured his hands on their shoulders, their waists, their faces. They played their parts perfectly. And no one, not a single one of the 100 people in that house, suspected they were watching the first act of a tragedy ending in death. By 11 p.m., most guests had departed. The remaining few were too drunk to notice much. Silas himself had consumed nearly 2 bottles of wine over the evening, in addition to his usual bourbon. He was swaying slightly as he made his way up the grand staircase, one hand on the railing, the other around Miriam's waist. Ruth followed a few steps behind, carrying a final glass of wine she had prepared herself. They entered the master bedroom together, and the door closed behind them. What happened in that room over the next hour was known only to 3 people, and 2 of them would never speak of it. But the physical evidence discovered the next morning told its own story. End of part 1. The master bedroom of Blackwood Plantation was the largest room in the house, occupying the entire southwest corner of the 2nd floor. 2 tall windows overlooked the front lawn and the long drive lined with oak trees. A 3rd window faced west toward the river, invisible in darkness but present in the humid breeze moving the curtains. The room was furnished with pieces imported from France and England, a 4-poster bed with silk hangings, a massive wardrobe of carved mahogany, chairs upholstered in velvet costing more than most families earned in a year. On this night, candles burned in silver holders on every surface, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Silas Blackwood stood in the center of this room, swaying slightly from the wine, looking at the 2 young women he believed belonged to him in every possible way. He had waited 12 years for this night. He had planned every detail. He had invited the most powerful people in the county to witness his claim. And now, finally, he would take what he considered rightfully his. He had no idea he had less than an hour to live. Ruth moved first. She approached Silas with the glass of wine she had carried from downstairs, the same wine she had been serving him all evening, but this glass was different. This glass contained 3 drops of water hemlock extract mixed with honey to mask any bitterness. She had calculated the dose carefully using knowledge passed through generations of Ashanti healers. Too little, and he might survive. Too much, and he would die before she wanted him to. The amount she used would take effect within 30 minutes, beginning with numbness in the extremities and progressing to paralysis of voluntary muscles while leaving the mind fully aware. He would be conscious for everything that followed. He would understand exactly what was happening and be unable to move or cry out as his body slowly shut down. Ruth handed him the glass with a smile. She told him it was a special vintage she had saved for this occasion. Silas took it without hesitation. Why would he suspect anything? These were his slaves. They had been obedient for 12 years. They had shown no resistance. He drained the glass in 3 long swallows and set it on the dresser. He would never pick up another object again. Miriam locked the bedroom door from inside and pocketed the key. This was a precaution they had discussed extensively. The lock would buy them time if anyone came to check on the master. It would also ensure Silas couldn't escape once he realized what was happening. She moved to the windows and closed the heavy curtains, blocking any outside view. The room was now sealed. Whatever happened next would stay between these walls until they chose to leave. Silas watched these preparations with confusion that slowly transformed into the first stirrings of fear. He asked what they were doing. His voice was already slightly slurred, though he probably attributed it to wine. Ruth told him they were making sure they wouldn't be disturbed. She told him they wanted this night private, just the 3 of them, no interruptions. Silas smiled at this, his fear momentarily replaced by anticipation. He still didn't understand. He still believed he was in control. That delusion would shatter within minutes. The first symptom appeared approximately 20 minutes after he drank the poisoned wine. Silas was sitting on the bed edge removing his boots when he noticed his fingers weren't working properly. They felt thick and clumsy, as if he wore gloves. He mentioned this casually, assuming he had simply drunk too much. Ruth and Miriam exchanged a glance he didn't see. They knew the poison was beginning its work. Within another 10 minutes, numbness had spread to his hands and feet. He tried to stand and found his legs wouldn't support him. He fell back onto the bed, his heart beginning to race as he finally realized something was seriously wrong. He demanded to know what was happening. He ordered them to fetch the doctor. His voice was weaker now, the muscles of his throat beginning to fail. Ruth sat down in a chair facing the bed and spoke to him in a tone he had never heard from her before. It was the voice of a free woman addressing an equal, or perhaps something less than an equal. She told him exactly what was happening to his body. She used the scientific terms she had learned from Mrs. Blackwood's medical books. She explained the poison would paralyze his muscles one by one while leaving his nerves fully functional, meaning he would feel everything but be unable to move or speak. She told him this would take approximately 2 hours, and she told him she and Miriam intended to spend those 2 hours making sure he understood why this was happening. What followed wasn't physical torture. Ruth and Miriam never touched Silas Blackwood except to arrange his paralyzed body so he could see them clearly. What they did was worse than physical pain for a man like Silas. They talked for nearly 2 hours while his body slowly shut down. They told him the truth about who they were and what they had been doing for 12 years. They spoke in English so he would understand every word, but occasionally switched to Chui, their native language, just to remind him they had an entire world he had never known about and could never access. They told him about their grandmother, the healer who had given them the knowledge now killing him. They told him about the night spent planning, the information gathered, the escape route mapped. They told him about Ezekiel and the carriage waiting behind the tobacco barn. They told him that by the time anyone found his body, they would be miles away, traveling through swamps no search party could navigate. And they told him something that seemed to cause more anguish than the poison itself. They told him they had never been broken, not for a single day. Every act of obedience had been performance. Every smile had been a lie. Every moment he thought he possessed them, they had been possessing him, gathering information, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. His entire understanding of his own life was wrong. He was not a master. He was a fool outsmarted by people he considered less than human. paralysis reached Silas's face around 1 a.m. He could no longer speak or change expression, but his eyes were still alive, still aware, still watching as Ruth and Miriam made their final preparations. They changed out of their white wedding dresses into simple dark clothing suitable for travel. They packed a small bag with food stolen from the kitchen, a knife, a compass Miriam had taken from Silas's study months ago, and forged travel papers Ezekiel had obtained from a contact in Natchez. These papers identified them as free women of color traveling to visit family in Illinois. The papers weren't perfect, but enough to pass casual inspection if stopped on the road. Ruth took one final item from her hidden pocket, a small pot of red dye made from beets she had prepared earlier in the week. She crossed to the white wall beside the bed and began to write. The letters were large and careful, designed to be visible from across the room. She wrote in Twi, using the alphabet missionaries had developed to transcribe the language. The words translated roughly to an old Ashanti proverb, "Those who do us evil, we collect the debt." She wanted whoever found the body to know this wasn't random violence. This was justice. This was a debt owed for 12 years and now paid in full. At approximately 1:30 a.m., Ruth checked Silas's pulse and found it growing weak and irregular. The poison had reached his heart. He had perhaps 30 minutes left. She leaned close to his face and spoke her final words to him. She told him she hoped there was an afterlife because she wanted him to spend eternity knowing he had been defeated by the people he tried to destroy. She told him she and Miriam would live free for the rest of their lives, and every day of that freedom would be built on his grave. She told him his name would be forgotten while their story would be passed through generations of their descendants. And then she thanked him. She thanked him for being so arrogant he never saw them as threats. She thanked him for giving them access to his house, his garden, his secrets. She thanked him for inviting the entire county to witness his humiliation because now there would be no way to cover up what happened. Everyone would know Silas Blackwood died at the hands of his slaves. That would be his legacy. Not his wealth, not his power, just the memory of how completely he had been destroyed by the people he underestimated. Ruth and Miriam left the bedroom at approximately 1:45 a.m. They locked the door behind them and took the key, which they later threw into the river. They moved through the silent house like ghosts, avoiding servants sleeping in back quarters, stepping over floorboards they knew would creak. They exited through the kitchen door, which Ruth had left unlocked earlier, and made their way across moonlit grounds toward the old tobacco barn at property's edge. The barn hadn't been used in years since Silas converted entirely to cotton, and its dark interior made a perfect hiding place for the carriage Ezekiel had prepared. He waited in the shadows, holding reins of 2 fastest horses in the Blackwood stables. He asked no questions when he saw them approaching. He simply helped them into the carriage and climbed to the driver's seat. Within minutes, they were moving, following back roads Ezekiel knew from years of secret journeys, heading east toward the Homachito wilderness and the river beyond. The route Ezekiel planned covered nearly 40 miles through some of Mississippi's most difficult terrain. The first section followed logging roads barely visible in darkness, winding through pine forests where trees blocked the stars. The horses were trained for speed, but Ezekiel held them to a steady trot, knowing a broken wheel or lame horse would doom them all. They traveled nearly 3 hours without stopping, putting maximum distance between themselves and Blackwood Plantation. By first gray light of dawn in the east, they had reached the Homachito swamp's edge, a vast wetland stretching miles along river bottoms. This was the journey's most dangerous part. The swamps housed alligators and water moccasins, and paths through them were known to only a handful. But the swamps were also the safest route to the river because no search party would dare follow into that maze of water and mud and hanging moss. Ezekiel guided the carriage as far as solid ground allowed, then stopped and helped Ruth and Miriam down. From here they would continue on foot. He led them along paths invisible to untrained eyes, stepping on roots and rocks keeping them above water, warning in whispers when approaching deeper sections. The swamp was alive with sound, frogs and insects, and occasional splashes of something large moving through water. But they saw no other humans. This wasn't land anyone wanted to claim. It was no man's territory between plantation country and the river, and it would shelter them until reaching safety. They walked nearly 4 hours, stopping only to drink from canteens Ezekiel packed and eat a few bites of cornbread. By mid-morning they could hear the river ahead, a low constant rush growing louder with each step. And then suddenly trees opened and they stood on the Mississippi bank, the great brown river dividing the country, carrying cotton to the world, and having carried so many enslaved people to their bondage. Ezekiel had arranged for a contact to meet them at a specific riverbank point, a spot marked by a distinctive dead tree struck by lightning years ago. The contact was a white man named Thomas, a Quaker from Ohio who made his living as a river trader but spent much time helping escaped slaves reach free territory. The Underground Railroad wasn't a formal organization but a loose network of individuals willing to risk lives and freedom helping others. Thomas was one of the most active conductors on the lower Mississippi and had helped Ezekiel guide runaways to safety many times before. His boat was a small steamship designed for cargo with hidden compartments below the waterline where passengers could hide during inspections. He was waiting at the dead tree when they arrived, pacing nervously and checking his pocket watch. The longer they stayed on the bank, the more dangerous their situation became. He hurried them aboard without wasting time on introductions and cast off immediately, steering into the current and heading north toward Cairo. The journey upriver took 3 days. Ruth, Miriam, and Ezekiel spent most of that time hidden in the cargo hold, emerging only at night when Thomas judged it safe. They passed dozens of other boats, some heading south with manufactured goods from northern factories, others heading north with cotton and sugar from southern plantations. Each passing vessel was a potential threat. Any might carry slave catchers or sheriffs with arrest warrants. But Thomas knew the river as well as Ezekiel knew the land, and timed their movements to minimize encounters. They stopped twice at safe houses along the bank, taking supplies and receiving news from the north. The news was promising. Illinois had strengthened laws protecting escaped slaves, and the Republican Party was gaining power with its anti-slavery platform. The world was changing. The system holding Ruth and Miriam in bondage for 12 years was beginning to crack. They might actually make it to freedom. Behind them, chaos erupted at Blackwood Plantation. Silas Blackwood's body was discovered at approximately 10 a.m. on Sunday, June 15, when a servant brought breakfast and found the bedroom door locked. After repeated knocking received no response, the overseer was summoned and broke down the door with a sledgehammer. The scene greeting them became the subject of horrified gossip throughout the county for years afterward. Silas lay on his bed in wedding clothes, his face frozen in terror, his body already stiffening. The red writing on the wall was clearly visible, though no one present could read it. The 2 enslaved women part of the ceremony the night before were nowhere to be found. Neither was head coachman Ezekiel, nor the finest carriage, nor 2 of the best horses. It didn't take long to piece together what happened. The local sheriff was summoned, and by noon, the largest manhunt in Adams County history was underway. Posses formed from neighboring plantations. Professional slave catchers were hired from as far as New Orleans. A $5,000 reward was posted for the twins' capture and $2,000 for Ezekiel, enormous sums attracting bounty hunters across the South. Telegraph messages went to every major city along the Mississippi, warning authorities to watch for 2 young black women traveling together. Dogs were brought to Blackwood Plantation to pick up scent, and they tracked as far as the Homachito swamp's edge before losing it in water. Search parties tried following, but several men were bitten by snakes. One nearly drowned in quicksand, and after 2 days finding nothing, the swamp search was abandoned. The fugitives vanished as completely as if earth swallowed them. The investigation into Silas Blackwood's death was complicated by lack of obvious wounds on his body. He hadn't been shot, stabbed, or strangled. No violent signs appeared in the bedroom. The county coroner, a man with limited medical training, was baffled. He noted the terror expression on the face and limb rigidity but couldn't identify a cause. Some witnesses suggested poison, pointing to the empty wine glass on the dresser, but without chemical analysis capability, this remained speculation. The coroner eventually ruled death resulting from unknown causes, a verdict satisfying no one but allowing the case officially closed. The general public, however, had no doubt. The twins had killed their master on his wedding night. Details might be unclear, but basic truth was obvious. And this truth terrified every slaveholder in the region. The fear spreading through Natchez in weeks following the Blackwood killing was unlike anything the county experienced. For generations, white Southerners reassured themselves their enslaved populations were content, or at least docile, kept in check by violence, threat, and absence of alternatives. The story of Ruth and Miriam shattered that illusion. Here were 2 women purchased as children, spending 12 years in a plantation household's heart, appearing perfectly trained and submissive, yet planning their master's death all along. If they could do it, anyone could. Every slave in every house was suddenly suspect. Every act of obedience might conceal murderous intent. Natchez authorities responded with increased patrols, stricter curfew enforcement, and harsher punishments for even minor infractions. But nothing could restore lost security. Slavery's system depended on psychological subjugation of the enslaved, convincing both masters and slaves resistance was impossible. Ruth and Miriam proved it wasn't. Meanwhile, Thomas's steamship continued north. They passed Memphis without incident, the city's waterfront crowded with boats too busy for anyone to notice a small cargo vessel. They passed the Missouri border, leaving slave territory but not yet reaching safety since Missouri was a slave state where they could still be legally captured. They passed St. Louis, where great rivers converged and traffic was thickest, hiding among hundreds of other boats making the same journey. And finally, on June 18 morning, 4 days after leaving Blackwood Plantation, they reached Cairo, Illinois. Thomas guided the boat to a small dock on the Illinois side away from main wharves where federal marshals sometimes waited to intercept runaways. He shook hands with Ezekiel and bowed to Ruth and Miriam. He told them from here they were on their own. Illinois was free soil. The law was on their side, though enforcement uncertain, and slave catchers sometimes operated illegally. He recommended continuing north as quickly as possible to Chicago or beyond to Canada if they could make it. He wished them luck and watched them walk up the bank toward town. 3 people escaping one of history's cruelest systems through intelligence, patience, and extraordinary courage. The next journey phase took them through the Underground Railroad network from safe house to safe house across Illinois and into Indiana, then Michigan, and finally across the border into Canada. It took nearly 3 weeks, traveling by night, hiding by day, never staying anywhere more than a few hours. They were pursued part of this journey by bounty hunters tracking north, but the Underground Railroad was experienced at evading such pursuers, and network conductors managed to stay one step ahead. They crossed into Canada near Detroit, taking a ferry across the narrow strait separating United States from British territory. Canada had abolished slavery throughout the British Empire in 1833, and American laws had no force there. The moment Ruth and Miriam stepped onto Canadian soil, they were legally and completely free for the first time in their lives. They were 19. They had been in bondage since age 7, and they had won. Ezekiel remained in Canada with them several months, helping them establish themselves in the black community growing around border towns. Many former slaves settled in this region, building farms and businesses and churches, creating a society where they could live without kidnap fear and return to bondage. Ruth and Miriam used skills developed at Blackwood Plantation to find work. Ruth became a cook at a hotel in Chatham, Ontario, a town known for its large American refugee population. Miriam worked as a seamstress, her careful stitching in demand among local families. They earned their own money for the first time in their lives. They walked streets without permission. They spoke minds without punishment fear. They were in every meaningful way human beings rather than property. And they never forgot what they had done to earn this freedom. They never regretted it for a moment. The letter arrived in Natchez in autumn 1859, more than 2 years after Silas Blackwood's death. It was addressed to Adams County Sheriff and postmarked from Toronto, Canada. Inside was a single paper sheet with 2 ink fingerprint sets and a brief message in elegant handwriting. The message said simply, "We survived. We prospered. We remember." There was no signature, but none was necessary. Everyone in Natchez knew who sent it. The letter was kept in county archives for decades, occasionally shown to curious visitors as evidence of 1857's strange events. It eventually disappeared during the Civil War when many county records were destroyed by fire, but copies had been made and story spread, and by letter's loss, the Blackwood twins' legend had taken independent life. What happened to Ruth and Miriam after reaching Canada isn't completely documented. Period records are incomplete, and black refugees had good reasons to avoid traces usable for tracking. What's known comes from fragmentary sources, church records, census data, occasional letters and diary mentions. Ruth appears to have married a man named James Monroe Wilson in 1862, a freeborn black man from Philadelphia who moved to Canada escaping northern cities' racial violence. They had 3 children together. Miriam married a year later to a man whose name hasn't survived in any record. She also had children. Both women lived into old age, Ruth dying in 1894 and Miriam in 1897. They never returned to the United States, though they followed news from their former country closely. They watched civil war from across the border, knowing their own small rebellion act had been part of larger current eventually destroying the slave system. They watched Reconstruction raise hopes for true equality. And they watched those hopes betrayed by Jim Crow's rise. They died knowing the struggle they joined wasn't yet won. But they also died knowing they had won their own personal battle. They had refused defeat. Ezekiel's fate is less certain. Some accounts say he remained in Canada until his 1870s death. Others claim he returned to the United States after Emancipation Proclamation, searching for wife and children sold away decades earlier. There's a record of a man matching his description in Freedmen's Bureau files from Louisiana, inquiring about a woman named Sarah sold to a New Orleans area plantation in 1849. Whether he found her is unknown. Records don't say, but the very existence of these inquiries suggests he never stopped looking. He spent the rest of his life trying to reassemble the family slavery tore apart. This was reality for millions of formerly enslaved people after war. Freedom meant not just bondage escape, but a new struggle beginning, finding lost loved ones, building new lives from nothing, claiming a place in society that never wanted to acknowledge their humanity. The story of Ruth and Miriam spread through black communities of the South in years after Civil War. Former slaves told it to children and grandchildren. It became part of oral tradition preserving resistance memory during times when official histories ignored or minimized black agency. The story changed as retold, as all stories change. Some versions added details possibly true or not. Some versions exaggerated violence or supernatural elements, but story core remained same. Two young women refused accepting fate. They used intelligence and patience and ancestral knowledge to defeat a man believing himself their absolute master. They escaped to freedom and lived to tell the tale. This wasn't victimhood. This was victory. And it mattered to hearers because it proved victory possible. Today, Blackwood Plantation no longer exists. The main house burned during Civil War, set afire by Union troops sweeping through region in 1863. Land was eventually sold and subdivided, cotton gave way to other crops and eventually suburban development. No historical marker stands at the site. No monument exists to Ruth and Miriam or the hundreds enslaved living and dying on that property. County archives contain only fragmentary Blackwood family records, most focusing on property transactions and tax assessments rather than human lives producing wealth. This is how history works. The powerful leave records. The powerless are forgotten. But sometimes, through extraordinary courage acts, the powerless force their way into historical record. They refuse to disappear quietly. They insist on being remembered. This is what Ruth and Miriam accomplished. They were two young women born into a system designed to erase them, treat them as property, deny them every human dignity aspect. They could have accepted this fate. Many did. Slavery's psychological weight was designed to crush all resistance hope. But Ruth and Miriam remembered who they were. They remembered knowledge their grandmother gave them. They remembered their true names, Adwoa and Akua, even as answering to names captors assigned. They remembered they were human beings with minds and wills and right to determine their own futures. And they spent 12 years waiting for the moment when memory could translate into action. When the moment came, they were ready. They didn't hesitate. They showed no mercy to a man showing none to them. They claimed freedom with their own hands and kept it for the rest of their lives. Their story's lesson isn't complicated. It requires no philosophical analysis or historical interpretation. The lesson is simply this: resistance is always possible. Even in darkest circumstances, even when the entire system is designed to prevent it, people find ways to fight back. Sometimes they fail. Many resistance acts during slavery ended in brutal punishment or death. But some succeed, and even failures matter because they prove human spirit can't be entirely extinguished. The American South slaveholders spent 2 centuries trying to create perfect control where enslaved population would accept bondage as natural and inevitable. They failed. They failed because human beings aren't property. They failed because you can't own someone's mind no matter how completely you control their body. They failed because in every generation, in every community, there were people like Ruth and Miriam refusing surrender. The slavery system was eventually destroyed, not just by armies and laws, but by accumulated weight of countless resistance acts, large and small, remembered and forgotten, proving the system couldn't last forever. We tell this story today not as entertainment but as evidence. Evidence that people suffering under slavery weren't passive victims waiting rescue. Evidence they fought back with every tool available, including tools their oppressors never suspected they possessed. Evidence that Black American history isn't just suffering history, but survival and resistance and ultimate triumph history. Ruth and Miriam didn't wait for Abraham Lincoln to free them. They didn't wait for Union Army to liberate the South. They freed themselves. They wrote their own Emancipation Proclamation in red letters on a white wall in a Mississippi mansion. And then they walked out of bondage into new life. That's who they were. That's what they did. And that's why their story deserves remembrance. Now you know the story history books never told. The story of twins who waited 12 years. The wedding ending in death. The 3 fugitives vanishing into swamps and emerging on the other side as free people. This is American history. Not the comfortable version. Not the version pretending slavery was long ago with no present connection. The real version. The version where enslaved people weren't objects but subjects, not victims but actors, not problems to be solved but people solving their own problems with courage and intelligence and unbreakable freedom will. Ruth and Miriam understood something their master never grasped. They understood freedom isn't given. It's taken. And once taken, it can never be taken away.